Good day, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arxen Alders, Senior Consultant at Grant Thornton, and I'm happy to be here today to talk a little bit about resource mobilization for biodiversity. I'd also like to mention that this presentation is a nice collaboration between Grant Thornton offices of Aruba, Bonaire, and the Netherlands. To start off, I'd like to revisit part of the background, part of the reason why we're all here, which is the biodiversity crisis and the biodiversity financing gap. Personally, this is one of the statistics that have struck me the most, that almost 70% of wildlife populations have declined in the past 50 years. This is a problem. Why? There are numerous reasons, but one is that more than half of the world's GDP is moderately to highly dependent on nature and nature services. So what are we doing about that? What are we doing about the financing gap? But first, let me summarize the financing gap in a nutshell. We're talking about a gap of about $800 billion annually. Right now, the current financing stands at about $140 billion annually. So there's still a long way to go globally. So this brings us back to the topic at hand, resource mobilization for biodiversity. How do we address the gap? And how do we achieve increase the sums being mobilized? I would like to approach these questions from two angles. First, a skills perspective. I think it's important to think about resource mobilizations from the context of four skills: local, landscape, national, and regional. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the upcoming slides, and they will also inform the structure of the rest of my slides. In addition, the second is what I think are some of the core objectives for better resource mobilization. The first one is especially honed on the local level, which is building an evidence-based case for biodiversity. I think previous speakers have elaborated on this point. Second is diversifying sources and finance mechanisms. This holds true for all the four levels. And the third one is eventually, with all the analysis and data gathered, it then becomes easier to design a sustainable finance model. So let's start by looking at the local level. There exists a wide range of financing mechanisms that can be implemented for a protected area. So this goes beyond donations, beyond grants, and also beyond government subsidies. Let me summarize this into four categories. Taxes dedicated to park area conservation, usually government-backed. Donor funds, we're talking about larger institutions such as conservation trust funds and large NGOs. We're talking about donations. These are mostly individuals, businesses, smaller NGOs. And fourth, the application of fees and sale of merchandise, which many protected area managers are already applying. Protected area benefit from having a diverse mix of these finance mechanisms. It lowers risk. Think about external shocks such as COVID or the overdependency on tourism. Point being, the unique context of a local setting is very decisive in getting to which types of finance mechanisms are opportune and can be implemented. Let me talk a little bit about the context-specific case for biodiversity. This is a simplified schematic based on coral reef ecosystem management and dive tags. Why are context-specific cases so important? Let me give one very basic reason. You want to gauge the difference between the value of benefits that people derive from ecosystems and what people actually pay for these services. If stakeholders accord a higher value to ecosystems but pay less than that, there's an opportunity to design a finance mechanism there. The idea is that beneficiaries should contribute to nature conservation, and it's about identifying which beneficiaries are contributing too little or not at all. And this then becomes a basis for, again, designing a finance mechanism. Let's go to the last, let's move on to the landscape level. But what do we mean by landscape? As opposed to a protected area, landscape have a larger scope that involves a multitude of stakeholders, not just nature conservation. These stakeholders have a role to play in the successful conservation of a landscape, and each have different types of financial needs. Different financing mechanisms can be identified for different types of stakeholders in the landscape. And any financing strategy must try to integrate these different needs and financing instruments. This is an example of the Gola forest in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And I don't want to dwell on all the list of the financing mechanisms, but point being the needed integration when you approach conservation from a landscape perspective. Let's go to the last two scale levels, national and regional. So I'm taking Costa Rica as an example. They committed to protect 30% of their waters by 2030. And the central question that follows are, what must additional finance, what must be financed, and how much will it cost? In the case of Costa Rica, the bottom line is that the previously set 2.9% was already underfinanced. Taking the 30% as a point of departure then, of course, implies that that financing gap has become even bigger. So what does Costa Rica do about that? What is their approach? I have 3 points. They are intensifying, for example, their international cooperation, their cooperation with international funds. They're embedding finance mechanisms into legislation, and they are engaging into and creating new public-private partnerships. And let me zoom into that last point, the PPPs. Again, 2 examples. On your left side, a national example, Costa Rica again. On your right side, a regional example, the Med Fund, covering the entire Mediterranean area. What both have in common is that they have a diversified set of donors working together for different areas within that landscape and different stakeholder needs. So I'd like to close off with a slide that you've already seen. That's because I think these objectives are at the same time also the takeaways for my presentation. So first and foremost, there needs to be an evidence-based case for biodiversity on a local level, which focuses on ecosystem services, their characteristics, finance mechanisms based on local beneficiaries. Second, diversification of funding sources and finance mechanisms should be pursued across all levels. Regarding the local level, think back to the list of finance mechanisms shown earlier. This is a very much a bottom-up approach to financing streams, right? Conversely, the national and the regional perspective informs us of a more top-down, institutional type finance stream through donors, CTFs, and other intermediaries. Lastly, the objective to design a financing model, I think it's sufficient to say that the better the previous two targets are aligned, the better financing model is created, and a resource mobilization strategy is a very helpful tool, in any case, a good point of departure for achieving this. So now we've come to the end of my presentation. I thank everyone, and I'm also looking at Michelle, whether I have to open the floor for questions or wait a second.